Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. These are fraught times in almost every way possible. Just as we seem to be making real progress in the battle for truth and transparency surrounding UFOs and non-human intelligence, there's been a change in national leadership that's leaving many in our field confused about the subject, about the motives and mission of those in the know, about the true inclinations of those seeking access to advanced tech, and about what information now percolating is actually worthy of our trust. When profit, weapons, national security, advanced technology, and secrets mix, it's hard to know how to read the room. One recent whistleblower, Jake Barber, has emerged with a story that differs with many of those that have gone before. His testimony is filled with details that confirm much of the whispering that we've heard over these past decades about the connection between psi phenomenon and UAPs, but some wonder if that is by design. If the picture he's painting seems to offer more hope than fear, can that be trusted? If what he says is true, what entity or attribute of the universe is represented by the transcendental feminine energies that so overwhelmed him? What does her presence and action say about us and the universe? Our guests today, remote viewer Birdie Jaworski and Jim Garrison, both of New Paradigm Institute and Ubiquity University, will help us explore these questions and also talk about an important upcoming event with Jake Barber, Richard Dolan, and others through Ubiquity to explore the connections between psi, plasma orbs, and NHI. The free event is linked below for those who may want more information. More than ever now, people need to develop and deploy their discernment and trust their own sense of what's right and what's wrong. By consulting with those we trust and never forgetting the need for our species to rethink its place in the universe, we have the best chance at threading this existential needle. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
So yeah, I mean, I haunt the social media forums. Some I like a lot more than others, but one of the things that's been happening a lot lately is that there's a lot of people expressing real concern and insecurity about this conversation now, because Donald Trump has taken office, and a lot of these folks aren't Trump supporters, and they worry that coupled with what they see as sort of at times a profiteering interest in the subject from those who would want to capitalize on the tech or figure out ways to, weaponize or make money on advances made through that technology. They worry basically that the topic is being pulled out from under them, and that the conversation that they thought they were having may not be the conversation moving forward, and that if disclosure happens when someone like Trump is in office and the people who are around Trump who kind of support this profiteering mode in some sense, they worry that if what comes out, if that can even be trusted. So I know that you two are long time, you've been in this conversation for a long time. Bertie, I've had you on the show multiple times, and I always love your insight. And I know that you have an ability to kind of take a deep peek at things that are under the surface that a lot of us can't see. And Jim, I know that you're have long been a voice for standing up for what you think is right. Recently, you stood up at the Soul Symposium and tried to ask a question about nukes and the UFO question, because just at that moment we were on high alert because of events that had happened in Ukraine. At Seoul, you were shut down rather impolitely. And so I knew that you'd be willing to take up this question and kind of address it head on, and give us your 2 cents on how we should be approaching both, revealing this potentially transcendent energy that could really, really help us and help us evolve as a species, and then also thread the needle of, how do we support the conversation without supporting some of the people who now seem to have glommed onto it. So if you don't mind, Bertie, I'll start with Jim. What are your thoughts on my statements just now, and the reality of what the UFO conversation is turning into?
Well, first of all, James, thank you for having us on. I think you're asking exactly the right question. And I'd like to frame it in 2 points. One is that I think the concern that almost everybody that I know has, including people who support Trump, is that the United States under Trump 2 is undergoing a change of state. I'm a historian, and so I look at these things within a historical context. And my view is that what is happening now with the excesses of the Biden administration and now the events transpiring under Donald Trump is essentially the end of the American Republic. I think that our democracy is in shatters. I think our imperial overreach that we saw with Joe Biden fomenting war in the European theater, in the Middle Eastern theater, and against China and Asia, that imperial overreach is characteristic of empires in decline. The closest analogy that I would offer for understanding what's going on in the United States, from my view, is the fall of the Roman Republic. Rome was built as a democracy, a representative democracy like ours. It lasted for several hundred years. They were very sensitive to a king taking over, and yet the Republic could not handle the internal contradictions and the burdens of empire as it was beginning to expand in the late Roman Republic period. And the internal systems collapsed. And what emerged was the Caesar. And I think that is what is going on. And whether we can stem the tide, I think is a very open question. And I'm happy to say more and engage in dialogue, but my view is the United States is in the advanced stages of imperial decline and democratic decline. And so the power of Trump is both because of the force of his personality, but because of the time, the trajectory of American imperial rise and fall. And so he's coming at a very, very singularly nuanced point, what Plato called the tyrant. What we're experiencing in Trump is what Plato called the tyrant at the moment of demise of democracy. Now, to the second comment I would make very quickly is that Jake Barber, I think, has had the impact that he has because he too, both because of the force of his personality, which is significant, but also because he's in alignment with the time. He's bringing into disclosure two very important ingredients in an incontrovertible way that hasn't been articulated, or I would say embodied before him. And that is number one, as someone coming right out of the intelligence community at very high levels, he says, I've touched them. I've actually carried UFO craft in my helicopter from one place to another. And Lou Elizondo couldn't say that. David Grush couldn't say that. Carl Nell couldn't say that. Nobody else that's come to the public profile has been able to say more than I talked to people who did. Jake Barber did it, and there's film. And secondly, and even more fundamentally, and this is where Birdie comes in, he's got the honesty and the courage to say, I've also been in communication with beings. Because when I was transporting one of those UFO objects, the being inside the object, or possibly the object itself, began to change my consciousness. And I experienced her as a sacred feminine presence. And she's been protecting me ever since. And he's crying on Ross Coulthart. And he's talking about this and Jesse Michaels. So here you have a man like Trump in a way, but in reverse, who's very authentic about who he is and is now midwifing in this next phase of UAP disclosure is there's zero doubt, everybody. Let's now get to know these beings and understand that they're ultimately benign. And that's a seismic shift and advance, in my view, for what we're doing. And one of the reasons why Ubiquity's partnered with Birdie to create this ET studies program at Ubiquity for master's and PhD degrees in partnership with transdimensional mapping, because what she's been doing is exactly what the world now needs.
Yeah. So let's turn to you, Birdie. I mean, one of the things that was so effective about Jake Barber's story coming out was that he had encountered this divine feminine energy that really, really shook him up and transformed him, and that was visceral on camera. I mean, all of us felt it. And for me, whatever doubts I had had going in that this might just be another guy coming out kind of propped up by whatever's trying to, maybe shape a narrative, like I read him as genuine. Now, some people aren't as sure, but I read him as quite genuine. I know that you've had experience where you've read through your, RVing process, transdimensional mapping, some contact with NHI. And I'm wondering if you've had what you would consider to be contact with this particular thing that Jake seems to have encountered, and what your thoughts are on how he described that experience and what it might mean for us moving forward in the disclosure/contact conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Jim about how significant Jake Barber coming forward is for the whole disclosure movement in terms of consciousness. Jake has really given all of us who have had either contact in some way or experiences of some nature, or those of us who are remote viewers and have had communication with non-human intelligence. So it's wonderful to have somebody prominently speaking in such a wonderful way about all these things, not from a national security narrative, but from rather an openness. These are our cosmic family. These are beings who are interested in our welfare. I 100% believe Jake. I found him to be very credible. And that's my gut feeling. I haven't remote viewed him, but I do feel that he's very credible, because the way that he talks about his experience really mirrors the experiences that I've had and that many have had in remote viewing or on the contactee or experiencer level. Just this idea that the energy is something that's non-masculine. You could, describe it as feminine. I have experienced that. And that deep love that has come through many, many times when I've encountered non-human intelligence, all different kinds of species over the many years that I've been working in this area. And many people that I have worked with too have described the same kind of a loving, feminine, gentle, protective energy. And we see this same kind of thing with some of our experiencers today. Chris Bledsoe is a really great example. He has seen the orbs in his backyard out on the East Coast. And then he describes this encounter with an entity that he calls the lady. And Chris frames it in more religious or spiritual terms than I think that I would be comfortable doing. But the lady is clearly this same kind of non-human intelligence that's loving and open and trying to show humanity that we have other answers. We can choose better solutions. I don't feel that any of these entities are pushing us in a strong, forceful way, a manipulative way. I rather feel that they're offering some kind of guidance or a light for us to look towards so that we make all the right decisions going forward. I think that we have free will, we have free agency, and we have the ability now to start thinking about humanity as a much greater, deeper, interconnected picture than just discrete entities who are constantly fighting over resources. I think we've got to move beyond that and into a whole new way of living.
Absolutely. And I think that we're getting to a point where if we don't make that decision, the consequences are going to get increasingly calamitous, which kind of, there's a part of me that watched this last campaign with Trump. and it seemed like so many of the dominoes fell in just the right way to kind of get him in the position that he's in. And I can't help but wonder if this is part of like some sort of I mean, it's a little I don't want to say it's not conspiratorial in that I don't think there are people in a room like making these decisions, but that we're being faced with a very stark choice of the energy represented by what Trump is doing and the energy that is represented potentially by this lady or other forms of NHI, and how we react to that choice, and how we choose to embody ourselves moving forward when we have these two polarities that we're kind of facing off with, is going to potentially dictate how our future unfolds. Any thoughts on that, Jim? And I'd like to hear your take on that too, Birdie.
Well, I think again you're raising a seminal question, James, and I would say that what we're experiencing in the United States is a coup in slow motion. I believe that there are people that are thinking very clearly and strategically about how to impose on the United States what is known as the unitary executive. And I think it's worth just pausing for a moment, because this is what's happening. And it's not new to Trump. It started in the administration of George Bush Jr. with the vice president, Dick Cheney. And you can see it in the movie that was made on Dick Cheney. You can read about it in the books. There's a theory put forward by very conservative historians and political scientists called the unitary presidency, which basically means that in their view, the president should not be encumbered by the traditional balance of power between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. It's sometimes referred to as the imperial presidency. And what Dick Cheney set in motion, and this was, back in the 1990s and then in 2000, when George Bush Jr. became president between 2000 and 2008, both a theoretical rationale for the coup. Think about the Patriot Act. Think about a lot of the legislation that's been exacted. It gives more and more power to the executive. You have the Supreme Court in the spring of, or rather the fall of 2024, right before the election, stating that a president is no longer to be held as under the law, that whatever the president does is above the law while he or she is in office. That was an embrace by the Supreme Court of the United States of this notion of the unitary presidency. J.D. Vance, all the key people in the Trump entourage are believers in the unitary executive. So what you see, there are two things that people need to watch. One, there's going to be now a systemic attack on the judiciary. You see it in the news as we speak, because the judiciary's been fighting back against Trump, and now the Republicans and the news media from the right and J.D. Vance just yesterday are starting a sustained attack on the judiciary. Number two, the only thing that's going to stop this thing is what's going to happen in the 2026 election. And there's data that's come out showing that the reason why Trump won last November is not because he got more votes. It's because through voter suppression and all kinds of manipulations of the polls, the Republicans were able to take about 10 million people off the rolls. That's going to continue. So young people, people of color, people who've been in jail, anyone who is suspect is going to increasingly be jeopardized in terms of exercising their constitutional right to vote. So people need to know this is happening. And I believe there is a conscious group of people who want this to happen and are now using the levers of power at the highest offices in the highest offices of land to implement this, because democracy now is being perceived as an enemy to an executive that actually wants to control everybody because he thinks he knows everything.
So I mean, all that I can see and understand, and my question is, how do we untangle the UFO conversation, which is blossoming at this very moment? It had started blossoming right prior to Trump's election, but now they're threaded together. And how do we know that I mean, how does regular people know, but that the revelations coming out about the UFO topic aren't somehow tied into this greater, potentially malign political project? Like, what can we do to have discernment about the events unfolding in ufology, to be smart about this moving forward and not allow ourselves to be, distracted, say, by, oh, the UFOs are real, but over here we're going to be doing all this stuff with democracy, or I mean, is there a way to read this and use this so that UFOs are real? Everybody stop what you're doing. We need to, basically pause on our political process so we can grok this existential issue and then come back to that process with that information. How do we make sure that happens and not the prior?
I'm happy to answer that
That's,
comment,
yeah,
but Birdie, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay, I'll go
please.
first on this one. I think, if we go back to what I will call the modern disclosure era, which began in roughly 2017, when Lou Elizondo came out of the closet, so to speak, as the ex-director of ATIP. And the New York Times had the Above the Fold article about the Tic Tac encounters with Commander David Fravor and others. They released those videos, the Tic Tac, the Go Fast, the Gimbal. And that really launched this modern disclosure period of time, which has lasted over 7 years now. We're going into our 8th year of this. And since that time, we have seen absolutely remarkable progress in terms of disclosure. We have a lot of congressional interest. We had the Brown-Schumer amendment, which didn't make it in full into the law, but there was some progress made along those times. We've seen some whistleblowers, some extraordinary whistleblowers come forward and testimony given in the congressional hearings. But one thing has remained true since all this began in 2017, and that is that this complete conversation has been entirely framed under the auspices of national security. You can't have anyone in Congress even mention the UAP phenomenon without national security coming out of the other side of their mouth. That's given, in a way, it's been good on one level because it's given the topic, changing UFO to UAP and framing it in that way, makes people feel like it's a legitimate issue and that it's okay to talk about. But on the other hand, it negates an enormous percentage of what the UFO phenomenon has been to humanity since the very start of humanity. We have had millions upon millions of encounters, I'm sure, going way back, and many thousands of encounters that have been cataloged in the modern era. And in all of that time, we haven't been invaded. No one's come to shoot up our planet. Overall, people haven't been harmed by this. There are some small number of cases, and those are debated as to whether those were intentional harmings or accidental because people got too close to equipment or something. But we haven't seen that this is a national security threat. Nothing seems to indicate that it is, except that it shows interest in our military capabilities. So I think that when you look at that, it hasn't seemed to matter since 2017 which administration has been in power, whether it was the Biden administration, well, Trump administration first, Biden administration, now Trump administration again, and we're still carrying that national security narrative forward. But what's interesting just recently with Jake Barber, and he's talking now about using consciousness to actually have some kind of communication connection. It's flipping that narrative on its head. And I think that even if the tentacles from from our current administration try to strangle what's happening now with disclosure in this shift of narrative, I don't think it's going to be successful, because more and more people are raising their heads and showing interest. Now that we're hearing this new story, it's re-energizing. I'm seeing how it's re-energizing the UFO community, many of whom have been turned off over the past 7 years because they felt that their experiences as having encounters or communication themselves, whatever their experience has been, they felt that had been completely ignored over the past 7 years with this hyper focus on reverse engineering and the whole military aspect. So I think that the Pandora's box has now opened, and I don't think that you can close it again. So I'm not that worried about what the Trump administration is going to do. I don't think they can stop what's happening, both on the human level and on the non-human intelligence level. I think that there's some synergy going on here, and we're going to see things escalate.
Jim, do you want to take a shot at that as well?
Yeah, I just want to underscore what Birdie said, 100%. Jake Barber is really piercing the underbelly of the national security state argument by saying, with tears coming down his cheeks, I've experienced her and she's actually benign. What do you mean national security? I mean, just the authenticity of that experience and the courage to communicate it transparently, I think has not only pierced that argument, but fortified the intuition of, I think, most people, that what you're saying, Birdie, if they were going to take over or do something harmful, they would have done it a long time ago. And the fact that they aren't, and they're here and they're warning and da 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 da, means there's probably far deeper motivations than just a fear-based national security issue. And I would just make an additional point, going back to your question about how we're holding these opposites together, James. Carl Jung said that when one has the opportunity to hold opposites together, that's the moment that's the most potentiated for personal growth.
Yeah, exactly.
And he called it an antinomy, where you have two mutually exclusive,
Yeah.
internally consistent truths, but they're not, one is true and one is false. They're both true. And it's our capacity to hold both these mutually exclusive truths together that engenders what Jung called the crucifixion of the ego. And what happens is our ego then has to expand if we don't let go, because the tendency is to let go and cling to one or cling to the other. But moral maturity is holding both in a dialectical tension and allowing that elixir, that fire, to expand the categories of consciousness so that we can hold the whole. And that's where I think it's going. And that's why I believe with Jung that there's an internal connection between Trump and Jake Barber. There's an internal connection between that which is falling apart and that which is leading us to a new consciousness.
Yeah.
They're not separate. They're held in what the Greeks called kairos, the fullness and the sacredness of the time which has come to fruition. And if you embrace the contradictions in that moment, the next phase of consciousness will be birthed through your capacity to hold the antinomial nature of reality together in your own soul. So I think I love the way that you were um, uh, uh, articulating that, because that's the cauldron we're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the worst of times and the best of times simultaneously interconnected, and it's all here for our growth and development if we don't let go. We
Exactly
got to
right.
ride the tiger, the tail of the tiger.
This is the breaking through potentially, but there's pain involved,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, it's growth,
yeah.
and that can be uh, traumatic
See, and
and
that's
all
where we
kinds of
get
things.
to Birdie, if I can just say,
Mhm.
because what's up for humanity is learning how to talk to these people,
Yeah. Yeah.
learning how to become aware of them and understand that we have the facility, like what happened to Jake Barber, uh, to reach a level of consciousness. And that's why we have our partnership in our ET studies program at Ubiquity University with transdimensional mapping, because we believe that this is the single most important frontier for humanity at this moment, given the antinomial reality of Trump and Barber and collapse of the Republic and breakthrough in consciousness to the cosmos. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment.
It is, and potentially terrifying. I mean, because it's like we don't know what the future holds, and a lot is going to depend on how we move forward these next few months, you know. Um, Bertie, I mean, like you have made a career, a successful career out of sort of cultivating your consciousness so that you can access these realms. I mean, what is it merely, okay, here's a thought I had recently. Okay, I was reading a book about what humans are and what we represent, and basically what it was saying is that there's a sort of a vast ocean of consciousness, and human beings sort of represent one, access point, one expression of that field of consciousness. But there are others that and other forms and beings that do the same thing, and that deep inner connectivity through consciousness is what people like Jake Barber and others who have had these kinds of experiences are tapping into. The contact modality is actually breaking through to this greater transcendent sphere that sort of underlies what Bohm might call the implicate order for the explicate order that we're living in. Is that your understanding? How would you describe it? And um, we talk often about how there are different kinds of NHI. What does that field look like? Is it teaming with different kinds of beings? And then how can we be sure that it's always going to be a positive interaction, I guess? It's a
Yeah,
lot. I'm
those are
sorry.
those. No, no, no. I can weave it all together, I promise.
Okay.
But just from my own explorations through the universe and our own human past and our human present into our human future and seeing everything that interacts with us, I feel like everything is connected. It seems to me that, for every action that happens over here, there's a reaction somewhere else. And we can see this in our own human lives, just on a day-to-day basis. How you interact with a person can change the trajectory of their day. And these things are always happening to us. We are both being influenced and influencing. And I think that all of this life that's out there is also doing the same. Now, there's a number of what I would call non-human intelligences that I believe have been with us on this planet for as long as we've been here. And I'm not sure where some of these came from. They might have come from the stars and settled here, or they might have just evolved organically like we did, but had a different kind of evolutionary path. There's certainly non-human intelligence like that. And you could call that intelligence alien, meaning it's non-human. But there have also been spacefaring people that have visited this planet. And we've had a number, so many different encounters through the years where people would get messages about where these beings were from. And in some cases, maybe they were just doing a flyby and stopped just to check it out. And in some cases, they seem to have had a long-term interaction and interest in us. And maybe they have a base here on the planet, or a base on the moon, or a base on Mars. You know, there's all kinds of theories and stories and things that remote viewers have talked about, you know, and identified in some way. But so there are many, many, many different kinds of species. And I think that the more that you involve yourself in any kind of a meditative or consciousness practice of some sort, like remote viewing or any of the other psychic arts, all these things are on a continuum. The more that you practice these kinds of things, the more experiences you just naturally have, because you're discovering a piece of yourself that's been missing, that's always been there, but it's been hidden because of all of our cultural conditioning, and particularly our growing reliance on technology. If you just look at, you know, since the Industrial Revolution, how much we have given our humanity over to the machines in our hands and on our desks. It's actually quite frightening if you look at brain science and the different hemispheres of the brain. Our left brains are more rational, controlling nature, loves and gloms on to technology. So the more you involve yourself with technology, you know, TikTok, social media, whatever you have going on, it feeds that left side of your brain and makes the right side of your brain, your natural, intuitive, creative side kind of lessen in some ways. And so I think that doing things involving consciousness helps that right hemisphere to activate. And then we tend to have these more organic and real experiences that have been described by the mystics and people who have a deep spiritual practice forever, going back through all of human history. It's time for us to kind of reclaim some of those roots so that we can start exploring again and start meeting our neighbors. It's easy to have a conversation. It really is. It's just like having a conversation with your friend or calling up your mom. You can do the same thing with any of these different species, and they'll contact you back oftentimes if they are a telepathic species or one that has evolved consciousness in some way. And in all 30 years I've been doing this, I've never had an encounter that I felt was threatening in any way or evil. Now, I think that different non-human intelligences have different motivations, and we tend to anthropomorphize all these motivations, and we look at it through very human lens. So we say, oh, those aliens are bad, they're no good, but these seem to be good, you know, and people have put all these different aliens into these different categories. But I don't think that we should look at it that way, and that we need to reframe even this conversation about, are these beings good or bad? I think that it's evident that they're not truly evil. They haven't obliterated us. They've had many opportunities through millennia. I think we need to start considering that perhaps that we are in connection, some kind of communion with them. But it doesn't mean that it's negative or bad if we don't understand what it is.
Yeah. And by sort of developing our own consciousness, maybe we can start to understand that also a little bit more for ourselves, right? Chart the geography of our own internal systems and figuring out how we connect with some of that more deeper transcendent levels. So let's talk about the event you guys have coming up. I mean, Jake Barber's involved, and I mean, there's what's going to be happening. What can people look forward to if they attend it? And it's free, which I think is remarkable. One of the things that a lot of people get accused of in this space is if you're doing something and you're charging for it, then you're grifting. That's the favorite word people want to use. And it's to put things on and to host conversations a lot of times costs money, and people need to realize that there are sometimes things that need to get
Oh,
paid
yeah.
for, but this event is not. And why was that choice made, and what does it look like? Jim, we'll start with you, and then Bertie, if you want to take a shot at it as well.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, good question, James. And just to comment on the costing for a moment, through Ubiquity University and our ET Studies department, we do charge as minimal amount as we have to keep body and soul together for our courses. So I do believe that there are uh, mechanisms of learning that historically have been paid for, not just by Ubiquity, but by learners all over the world since time immemorial. So that's just part of, I think, human culture. And I want to dignify it and respect it. I don't think it's fair to call anyone who charges money for something a grifter, because this is what the economy is an exchange of goods and services in a fair way. I want to make one preliminary point, which I think is the reason why we've done the Psionics Summit, which builds on what Bertie said before, and that is, by all accounts, including Jake Barber and various Courtney Brown and various others, including Birdie, uh, the phenomenon of the orbs, shall we call it, which were first called drones. Remember, back in November, they were called drones, and then all of a sudden they got a lot more mysterious than drones. And then all, like so many things, human language failed to really encapsulate the experience. And that's worth noting, just parenthetically. The Eskimos have got like something like 30 or 40 names for snow. We, over the last 80 years, had one word for the most complex, extraordinary phenomenon ever experienced, and that was just UFO. And one of the things I would just note for people it's breaking down. There's UAP, there's extraterrestrials, there's crypto terrestrials, there's ultra terrestrials. And I would predict that over the next 5 to 10 years, humanity is going to come up with about as many words for ETs as there are Eskimo words for snow, maybe more, as we gather more and more information. So psionics is now up. 3 months ago, who heard about psionics? Except for some, remote viewers that are sort of aficionados like Birdie and others, but nobody in the public knew about psionics. And all of a sudden, there is these drones, and then, well, there's orbs, and then all of a sudden, people started to look at Chris Bledsoe and realize this guy's been talking about orbs for the last 15 years. Maybe we should listen to him. And so we're in one of those extraordinarily delicious moments where it's like looking through the looking glass. We're going down the rabbit hole and we're realizing we're in a completely new universe. And so what Ubiquity's been doing with transdimensional mapping, we're co-convening a summit on psionics because we want to take the conversation to the next level, support Jake Barber and Russ Coulthart and Richard Dolan and Birdie Jaworski and Chris Bledsoe and Pippa Malmgren. There's going to be a number of really extraordinary people there. I was just contacted day before yesterday by a woman who's been working in remote viewing inside the CIA and the military, and she says she wants to come out and she wants to be on the program because she wants to talk about it because she's got a very specific point of view. So the Psionic Summit is being offered as a public education, just as a public service, like your podcast. This is a public service. This is about the global commons of knowledge. And we had one in December when the drone phenomenon broke out, and it was clear to many of us that this was not just happening in New Jersey, but this was global. It was escalating, and the governments didn't have the slightest idea what was going on. Then Jake Barber came out, and we thought, geez, I contacted Ross, and he connected me with Jake, and we said, let's do a psionics summit. Let's put something together. So Birdie and Chris, everybody's in on it, and we'll probably do more after this. And I want to underscore one point. More and more people are saying that 2025 is the year. That what Birdie was talking about earlier, that kind of the modern disclosure quickened in 2017 when Lou Elizondo gave that information to the New York Times. And we saw the first videos of the UFOs. And then that triggered the next phase. And I have this feeling that Jake Barber, building on David Grush, we're all dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
This year, somehow, there's going to be levels of disclosure that are going to take it from the controlled disclosure that keeps it within the national security framework that Birdie was talking about, and is going to blow that wide open. And that's why, in our view, James, the most important thing we're doing with Birdie Jaworski is teaching people how to remote view with the specific intent for ET communication. Just imagine if thousands, millions, billions of people started a practice that gave them the capacity to communicate intelligibly with ETs, our world would change. And the reason why it would change is because in order to do that, you have to change your consciousness. We're all stuck in Einstein's box, that the consciousness that produced the problem can't solve it. The ET phenomenon, again, Jake Barber, Donald Trump, is surfacing right at the moment because it's the key, the catalytic portal to the change of consciousness that we need in order to completely reframe everything that Donald Trump and his minions are plotting to take over the United States for profit. And if I could add one more note, I mean, look at Elon Musk. When he was on Joe Rogan and even he was around the White House, he has this big T-shirt saying "Occupy Mars." That's the last thing we want to do, ladies and gentlemen. We don't want to occupy Mars. We don't want to do to Mars what the Spanish conquistadors did to Mexico and did to Pizarro did to the Incas in Peru. We don't want to conquer the natives and set up a factory to extract minerals, to ship it back to Earth to be worked in sweat factories. The whole point of this exercise is not to occupy Mars, but to communicate with the extraterrestrial beings that are on Mars. That's what is the challenge. And that's why ET communication and ET awareness is what is, I believe, is paradoxically, the number one national security issue of our time, to communicate with these beings.
Thank you for that. Birdie, in terms of, there's a couple questions I had that we related to earlier in the show. You mentioned that Chris Bledsoe made some news recently about calling what he was experiencing Jesus. And there were a lot of people who kind of put the brakes on and are like, whoa, are we going down this suddenly fundamentalist path? My argument at the time was that people see things through their different interpretive lenses and they call energies certain things, and that may not be what we all conceive of when we think back to our sitting in the pew and hearing about hellfire and damnation. It's just it's a way that we all kind of conceive and label the world. But can you talk about how you processed that? I mean, I know that you're not a fundamentalist in that regard, but you're still, kind of considering and delving in these conversations and seeing some of these energies. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that you can never take yourself out of the process or out of the experience. You always see everything through your own lenses, whether it's religion, spirituality, education, upbringing, cultural awareness. I mean, there are a million filters that we gaze through when we look at anything. And if you look just through human history, all of the, I don't even know how many recorded sightings throughout time. Jacques Vallée has this amazing book called Wonders in the Sky.
Mhm.
And it's a compendium of all of these different experiences, visitations, and sightings that have been recorded throughout human history. They're all sourced in the book. And many of these were given a religious significance at the time by the humans that experienced these things. Because when you see something that touches you internally, you have a deeply spiritual experience, much like Jake Barber did with the egg. He had that deep spiritual awakening. And this is what happens over and over again with different contactees and experiencers. And many of them struggle to understand what that means. And it can be comfortable to put it into a religious framework, because especially if you've grown up in a particular religion and you spent all your formative years in that religion, you've read about it, you've studied it, you've gone to services, you've been a good little whatever the denomination is. And it can be so difficult when you have an encounter like that to not see it in those terms, because that is how you've ordered your universe in your mind. You've ordered it with this hierarchy of beings. Here's your plant life and your cats and dogs, maybe your horses here. Then we've got humans, and then we've got the angels, and then God and Jesus and everybody else up in heaven. So I think that for many people to see it in that light makes sense to me. I understand why somebody would feel that way and feel it strongly, because they are having an intense and very real experience that speaks to on that soul level, that deep consciousness level. And it could be that what has happened through millennia is that all of our religions, because there are so many similarities between all human religions, they all tend to preach the same fundamental truths. They have the same kinds of codes of ethics and morality. And I think that it might be that many of these religions sprung up out of these kinds of paranormal or supernormal experiences. And so I don't think that it's wrong for Chris to say that this is how he views it. I believe that he believes that. I actually remote viewed. I did a transdimensional mapping session on Chris Bledsoe. This was a blind session someone gave me because they were curious about Chris's reported encounter with the lady, which is a feminine energy being of some sort. And I did a session on that. And it was a real experience. I 100% believe this experience happened in exactly the way that Chris described. But I didn't interpret it to be anything religious whatsoever. It felt very non-human to me, but I have a lot of experience remote viewing non-human, different kinds of intelligences. And it, even though it felt like it had this whole body, that was more of a projection of some kind of deep, beautiful consciousness that existed, in kind of like when I remote viewed the drones and I felt there was a pinpoint, almost a quantum pinpoint from which their consciousness sprung. This other being was different, but there was a similarity there where there was some kind of projection around some real central consciousness. So I think that if people need to describe it in these terms, I think that Dr. Diana Pasulka talks about this in this way, that so many people have described these in religious terms because they don't have another way to describe it. So that's my thoughts on Chris.
Exactly right. And I think that if we look at NDEs as kind of an example, people often, that is a way that I think people can experience the transcendent, and if they come back, then they describe things in the language that they have culturally to describe it. And a lot of people encounter people from their scriptures, and I mean they're all encountering something different, but they bring back stories that represent the same kinds of energy, but they fit whatever their sort of internal logic and sense dictates, which I think is natural. It's just the way that it's like language, how you understand, the world around you. That's
Right.
pretty much all I had. Did you want to go
Could
ahead?
I make a comment on that?
Please. Yes.
Because this is very rich. And the comment that I would make is that not only is Chris Bledsoe interpreting the phenomenon through his evangelical Christian background, but I would assert it's also happening because it's true, meaning JC Superstar is there. And I think that it's really, for me, important to take a couple of things into consideration. Number one, the ET experience and the near-death experience that you were just referring to, James, is almost exactly the same, right? Now, when you put the ET experience together with the near-death experiences, you begin to open up the reality of consciousness, and that death is not a final movement of being. And Jesus died 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, and Chris Bledsoe may be thinking about this being within his religious things, just like a Hindu would think about it in India. That's also true. But I would like to assert that death is beginning to be understood as a portal through which this life takes another form. And that Jesus and the ancestors and, my uncle Elmer that passed many years ago are on a different plane of reality. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the point. We are now, as humans, moving from the density of this is little Jim in 5'8" body with his skin and his clothes. And I look across the screen and I see Birdie and James as different objects. That's all breaking down into a theory of cosmology where it's all interactive oneness, not only spatially, but temporally. And that we have just as much access to the future as to the past because it didn't go away. As Eliot says, the end is before the beginning and the beginning is after the end, and all is always now. And, like the recent conversation in the class we had with Birdie, blew me away because Birdie was saying she's got ET friends that she's been talking to for years. Well, Birdie, that kind of blew me away. I never thought that thought before. But again, it's an example of is that the more we're getting into us, the more intimate it's becoming. And the more fluid our rigid categories of time, space, and causality are becoming. And time is beginning to shape shift into timelessness, space into spaciousness, and causality into synchronicity.
Mm-hmm.
That's the excitement of remote viewing. That's the excitement of mental telepathy. That's the excitement of the ET and the near-death experience and all the other things that are bursting upon us. And that's why it's such a great time to be alive.
And lots of opportunity. And coming to this event may give folks a start on how to build their own knowledge base on this stuff and eventually become practitioners themselves. That was a fantastic conversation. And I think that we really addressed a lot of issues that are really affecting people right now. So I really want to thank you both for taking the time and helping me navigate through this and learn about this event that I'll be attending coming up soon. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Birdie.
Thank you, James. Thanks, Jim.
I love